My daughter threw a heavy architectural blueprint onto the table in front of her mother, a woman who had barely survived a massive stroke just 4 months ago, and demanded she build 50 giant floral centerpieces by hand. Worse, she explicitly ordered her own mother to remain hidden in a back bedroom in her wheelchair for the entirety of the upcoming engagement party. She claimed with a straight face that her mother's recovering, slightly drooping smile would completely ruin the flawless aesthetic of her Instagram photos. So I triggered a military-grade digital lockdown of our entire smart estate, canceled their fraudulently funded luxury yacht honeymoon, and boarded a first-class flight to a remote cabin in Switzerland with my wife. We left them locked out in the freezing dark just as their wealthy guests arrived. Their hysterical, panicked screaming through my encrypted security cameras was the most satisfying symphony I have ever heard. My name is Arthur. I am 62 years old, and I spent my entire professional career as a cybersecurity architect designing impenetrable firewalls and isolating malicious threats for some of the world's largest tech conglomerates. I know how to detect a parasite, and more importantly, I know exactly how to execute a total system wipe. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to build a permanent, unbreakable firewall against a toxic family member who severely underestimated your resolve. The air inside the glass-enclosed botanical conservatory was thick with the scent of damp earth and crushed eucalyptus. It was a space I had built specifically for my wife, Eleanor, a sanctuary where she used to spend hours weaving breathtaking floral tapestries. For 20 years, her hands had possessed a quiet, fluid magic, but that magic had been violently interrupted. Exactly 4 months ago, a severe stroke had ripped through her brain like a sudden power surge, short-circuiting the vibrant life we had built. She survived, but the aftermath was a grueling, agonizing reality. The stroke had left the entire left side of her body severely weakened. Her graceful hands now struggled to grasp a simple porcelain teacup. The left side of her beautiful face bore a slight, permanent droop, a physical testament to the horrific battle she had fought just to stay alive. Every single movement she made required an immense, sweat-inducing effort. She was undergoing intense physical therapy, fighting for millimeters of progress every single day. She was incredibly fragile, but to my eyes, as she sat in her specialized wheelchair, she had never been more beautiful or more worthy of protection. I thought our sprawling suburban estate would be the ultimate safe haven for her to heal. I was profoundly wrong. The threat was not external. It had a key to our front door. I was standing quietly in the shadowed hallway just outside the conservatory, having just returned from an afternoon meeting. The heavy wooden door was slightly ajar. Before I could push it open, I heard the sharp, rhythmic, and aggressive clicking of designer heels against the terracotta tiles. It was a sound that belonged in a sterile corporate boardroom, not in Eleanor's healing space. It was my 28-year-old daughter, Chloe. Chloe was a self-proclaimed lifestyle influencer, a woman whose entire existence was meticulously curated, filtered, and heavily edited for the consumption of strangers on the internet. Her currency was digital validation. Her reality was a hollow facade. Standing beside her was Julian, her 32-year-old fiancé. Julian marketed himself as a visionary tech entrepreneur, a man perpetually on the verge of securing massive venture capital funding. In truth, he was a hollow suit who spoke exclusively in buzzwords and aggressively projected a wealth he simply did not possess. I kept my presence hidden in the shadows, my eyes fixed on the scene unfolding in the sunlit room. Eleanor was seated at her grand wooden potting table. Her breathing was shallow and visibly labored. Spread out across the table in front of her was a massive, glossy architectural blueprint. Chloe stood over her mother, her posture radiating manufactured dominance. She tapped a manicured finger aggressively against the heavy paper. Chloe and Julian had recently announced they were hosting an elite engagement party. "Nah, ma, go and so there and do it." They claimed they wanted an intimate, family-oriented gathering, but the underlying truth was entirely transparent. They intended to use our magnificent estate and its renowned gardens as a free, luxurious backdrop to impress Julian's prospective venture capital investors. They wanted to project the aesthetic of generational wealth without spending a single dime of their own non-existent capital. "I need 50 of these, Mom," Chloe's voice rang out, sharp, demanding, and completely devoid of human warmth. She tapped the blueprint again. 50 massive, cascading floral centerpieces. I've selected imported white orchids, hydrangeas, and trailing ivy. The caterers are charging an absolute fortune for decor, and since you used to do this for a living, you can handle it. It will save us thousands, and it needs to be perfectly uniform. The investors Julian is bringing expect a certain standard. I watched my wife's shoulders tense. Eleanor reached out with her trembling right hand, trying to touch the heavy paper. Her left arm rested uselessly, heavily on her lap. It took her immense effort just to form the words. "Chloe, sweetheart." Eleanor's voice was a soft, strained whisper, breaking with physical exhaustion. 50 arrangements. That requires heavy wire cutting, lifting the soaked foam. I can barely hold the pruning shears right now. My left hand. Julian checked his expensive smartwatch, sighing audibly, as if Eleanor's severe neurological damage was nothing more than a minor scheduling inconvenience holding up his day. "You have 3 days, Mom. You can just take your time." Chloe dismissed her mother's physical agony with a careless, arrogant wave of her hand. But the horrific demands did not end there. Chloe leaned closer, resting her hands on the table. She lowered her voice into a tone of manufactured, toxic sweetness that made my blood run instantly cold. "And, Mom, about the actual party on Saturday evening," Chloe began, her eyes darting away for a brief, cowardly second before locking back onto Eleanor's tired, drooping face. "Julian and I have been talking. The guest list is incredibly exclusive. These are high-net-worth individuals. The optics of this event have to be absolutely flawless for Julian's seed round." Chloe paused, inhaling deeply before delivering a blow that shattered whatever remaining illusion of family I still held on to. "It would probably be best if you stayed in the West Wing bedroom during the reception," Chloe said, her words coated in a sickening fake empathy. "With the wheelchair, and, well, with your face still recovering, it's just going to draw the wrong kind of attention. People will ask questions. It will bring down the energy of the room. We just want a perfect, seamless aesthetic, and having you out there looking like this. It doesn't fit the brand we are trying to project. You understand, right? It's just business." She wasn't asking for a favor. She was issuing a directive. She was explicitly ordering the woman who had given her life, a woman who had nearly died 4 months ago, to lock herself in a dark room like a shameful secret so her physical disability wouldn't ruin a social media aesthetic. I felt the oxygen completely evacuate from my lungs. The anger that flooded my veins was not a hot, explosive rage. In my decades of cybersecurity, I had learned that emotional, loud outbursts are a fatal vulnerability. They make you reckless. The anger I felt was an absolute, terrifyingly cold crystallization of reality. I watched Eleanor look down at her lap. A single tear escaped her right eye, carving a silent, devastating path down her cheek. Yet despite the crushing humiliation, the deeply ingrained maternal instinct to please her ungrateful child kicked in. Eleanor slowly, painfully reached out her trembling right hand toward a pair of heavy iron pruning shears resting near a bundle of the thorny wild roses Chloe had dumped on the table. Eleanor's weakened fingers slipped. The heavy metal shears snapped shut awkwardly, trapping a thick rose stem against her delicate skin. A sharp, jagged thorn sliced deep into her palm. A bright bead of crimson blood welled up, dropping onto the pristine white blueprint. Eleanor gasped, her body shaking from the sudden pain and the overwhelming exhaustion. Chloe did not rush to help. Instead, she actually rolled her eyes, letting out a frustrated huff about the blood ruining her diagram. I did not scream. I did not shout a single word of reprimand or curse their names. Screaming suggests a negotiation. It is a plea for the other party to understand your perspective. I had absolutely no desire to negotiate with the two parasites standing in my home. I stepped out of the shadows and walked directly into the conservatory. My footsteps were steady, echoing with a deliberate, heavy finality on the tiles. Chloe and Julian turned, their expressions shifting into sudden, awkward surprise. But I completely ignored their presence. They ceased to be my daughter and future son-in-law in that exact moment. They became hostile entities. They became malware that needed to be permanently quarantined. I walked straight to Eleanor. I gently, but with absolute unyielding firmness, took the heavy iron shears from her bleeding, shaking hand. The sudden silence in the glass room was deafening. I pulled a clean linen handkerchief from my suit pocket and carefully wrapped it around her wounded palm, pressing softly to stop the bleeding. "Arthur," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling with unshed tears and deep, profound humiliation. "Hush, my love," I murmured softly, a tone reserved exclusively for her. "You are done working." I engaged the brakes on her wheelchair. I did not look at Chloe. I did not look at Julian. I simply turned Eleanor's chair around and began to push her away from the table, away from the blueprints, and away from the toxic ambition that had infected our sanctuary. "Dad, what are you doing?" Chloe's voice spiked with irritation and entitlement behind me. "She needs to start on those centerpieces today. The party is in 3 days." I stopped in the doorway. I did not turn my head. I kept my back to them, my hands resting protectively on the handles of Eleanor's wheelchair. The silence stretched for 3 agonizing, heavy seconds. I pushed the wheelchair forward, crossing the threshold and leaving them standing alone in the conservatory. I guided my wife down the long, quiet hallway toward our master suite. I tucked her into our bed, drawing the heavy curtains to block out the harsh afternoon light. I sat beside her, holding her uninjured hand in the quiet dark until her breathing slowed and she finally drifted into an exhausted, much-needed sleep. I stood up in the darkened room. The indulgent, forgiving father who had overlooked Chloe's growing narcissism for years died right there, in the shadows. In his place stood the architect, the man who deals exclusively in zero-trust environments, strict access controls, and absolute system isolation. They wanted to use our estate to project a fraudulent reality. They wanted to harvest my wife's dignity to fund their vanity. They had severely miscalculated the strength of the firewall they were trying to breach. I walked out of the bedroom, turning my steps toward the basement stairs where my servers hummed in the dark. The audit was over, and the extraction was about to begin. The descent into the basement of my estate was a physical transition from the fragile, emotional world of my wife's suffering into a cold, uncompromising realm of absolute logic. The heavy oak door sealed shut behind me, cutting off the faint, ambient noises of the house above. Down here, beneath the sprawling botanical gardens and the expansive hardwood floors, there was only the steady, rhythmic hum of high-end servers and the rhythmic blinking of LED indicators in the dark. This was my sanctuary. This was the command center from which I had spent decades designing complex, impenetrable firewalls and digital security architectures for global conglomerates. For 40 years, corporations had paid me exorbitant sums of money to find the hidden vulnerabilities in their networks, to trace digital footprints left by sophisticated corporate spies, and to isolate catastrophic threats before they could consume the host. I dealt in zero-day exploits, encrypted data packets, and the undeniable truth of raw code. In my profession, there is a fundamental axiom. Humans will lie to your face with tears in their eyes, but data never lies. Digital footprints are the ultimate, unvarnished truth. I sat down in the ergonomic leather chair at the center of my console. The array of massive, high-definition monitors flared to life, casting a stark, icy blue glow across my face. I did not open physical filing cabinets, nor did I log into standard bank accounts to look at monthly statements like a traditional forensic auditor. Traditional banking alerts are designed for the masses. They are clumsy, slow, and easily bypassed by anyone with a modicum of cunning. I was not going to look at the polished surface. I was going directly into the deep foundational wiring of our lives. Chloe and Julian had been living in our guest wing for the past 6 months, complaining about the housing market while enjoying the luxury of my fully funded estate. For 6 months, their smartphones, their laptops, and their tablets had been blindly, comfortably connected to my private, custom-built Wi-Fi network. They had operated under the foolish, arrogant assumption that the router blinking in the hallway was just a standard appliance. They had completely forgotten who owned the network, who built the nodes, and who controlled every single byte of data that flowed through the digital veins of this property. I initiated a deep packet inspection protocol, a sophisticated network monitoring tool that captures and analyzes the traffic moving across my servers. I isolated the specific MAC addresses belonging to Chloe's devices and Julian's heavily branded, notoriously unsecured laptop. I was not invading their privacy. They had willingly brought a malicious infection into my sovereign territory, and I was simply running a diagnostic scan on the malware. I started with my daughter. I traced the outbound financial requests originating from Chloe's IP address over the last 120 days. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, decrypting the local traffic and following the digital breadcrumbs. What I found did not just break my heart. It fundamentally altered the chemical composition of my soul. When Eleanor suffered her massive stroke, I established a highly secure, high-yield medical emergency fund. It was an automated account specifically engineered to cover the staggering, ongoing costs of her recovery. It was designed to auto-pay the specialized in-home neurological nurses, the physical therapists, and the exorbitant costs of her imported medications. It was the financial life support system I had built to ensure my wife would never experience a single moment of discomfort or delay in her care. I had granted Chloe administrative access to this specific account months ago, trusting her to manage the daily logistical payouts while I spent my days by Eleanor's hospital bedside. The data unspooling across my screen revealed a systematic, horrifying bleed. Chloe had gone into the back end of the auto-pay system. She had purposefully intercepted the outbound payments intended for Eleanor's specialized physical therapy sessions, the very sessions designed to help her mother regain the ability to walk and hold a simple cup of tea. She had flagged the expensive in-home nursing invoices as disputed, delaying the payments to the women who bathed her mother, and instead systematically siphoned tens of thousands of dollars into a series of untraceable third-party digital wallets. I traced the destination of those stolen funds with ruthless, surgical precision. The money meant to alleviate my wife's physical agony did not go toward a desperate emergency or a misguided investment. It was routed directly to offshore shell companies specializing in social engagement optimization. Chloe, the grand lifestyle influencer, had been aggressively bleeding her crippled mother's medical fund to purchase over 500,000 fake bot followers on social media. She was buying fraudulent likes, automated comments, and a fabricated digital relevance, completely subsidized by Eleanor's pain. But the theft did not end there. A massive lump sum wire transfer had been executed just 3 weeks prior. The routing numbers pointed to a luxury maritime brokerage in the Mediterranean. Chloe had stolen the capital meant for Eleanor's future surgeries to place a non-refundable premium deposit on a 2-week ultra-luxury yacht charter along the Amalfi Coast for her upcoming honeymoon. I sat in the glow of the monitors, the sheer, breathtaking cruelty of her actions washing over me. My daughter had looked at her mother's paralyzed, drooping face, looked at the account designed to heal her, and made the conscious, deliberate decision that her fake internet fame and her vain, unearned vacation were of a higher priority. She had traded her mother's basic human dignity for the hollow, meaningless dopamine of a notification ping. The sorrow that had gripped my chest in the conservatory instantly evaporated. It was entirely replaced by the cold, calculating clarity of an executioner. I shifted my focus on the monitors. It was time to audit the fiancé. Julian presented himself as a Silicon Valley visionary, a man perpetually wrapped in the aura of high-level venture capital. But as I intercepted his outgoing email traffic and bypassed the pathetic, amateur-level encryption on his laptop, I discovered exactly what kind of visionary he truly was. A man who could not even properly secure his own smartphone was currently attempting to secure millions of dollars in Series A funding from some of the most ruthless investment firms in the country. I cracked into a hidden, encrypted folder buried deep within his local drive. It contained a massive PDF document, a highly polished, professionally designed financial prospectus that he had recently emailed to a dozen prominent venture capital partners. I opened the file. The title page featured a stunning high-definition drone photograph of my entire estate. It showcased the sweeping botanical gardens, the pristine architecture of the mansion, and the vast acreage of the property. I scrolled down, my eyes scanning the heavily formatted text. Julian was pitching a revolutionary tech startup, demanding millions in seed money. But to convince these elite, cynical investors that he was a man of substance, a man worthy of their trust and capital, he had constructed a colossal, fraudulent narrative. In the assets and collateral section of the prospectus, Julian had explicitly listed my home, the sanctuary I had bought and paid for over 30 years, as his own secured familial collateral. He had forged digital property deeds and falsified trust documents to suggest that he was the sole legal heir and the managing partner of the estate's holdings. He had spun an elaborate, fictional backstory claiming that his wealthy, retiring in-laws had transferred the multi-million-dollar property into his name to leverage for his brilliant entrepreneurial ventures. He was using the physical foundation of my life's work, the very roof over my head, to secure millions in fraudulent funding. The audacity was so profound it bordered on the psychotic. They were not merely ungrateful children behaving badly, they were active, malicious predators. Chloe was cannibalizing her mother's physical health to fund a digital illusion, and Julian was weaponizing my lifelong labor to execute a massive corporate fraud. They were hosting an elite engagement party on my lawn, not to celebrate love, but to walk investors through a property they were actively pretending to own. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair. The basement was utterly silent, save for the low, steady whisper of the server cooling fans. The blue light from the monitors reflected in my eyes, illuminating a face that no longer held a single trace of paternal leniency. In cybersecurity, when a core system is breached by a highly destructive parasite, you do not attempt to reason with the malware. You do not ask the virus to kindly stop deleting files. You do not negotiate. You immediately sever the connection, you lock down the compromised sectors, and you initiate a total, uncompromising system wipe to protect the host. Eleanor was my host. She was the absolute center of my universe, the only thing in this world that truly mattered to me, and I was going to protect her with every weapon in my digital arsenal. I placed my hands back onto the mechanical keyboard. The keystrokes echoed sharply in the dark room, sounding like the racking of a firearm. I was no longer a grieving husband, and I was no longer a disappointed father. I was the architect, and I was about to rewrite the foundational code of their reality. The illusions they had bought with my wife's blood were about to be permanently shattered. The final firewall was officially activated. Dawn broke over the estate with a pale, indifferent light, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns and the glass roof of the conservatory, while the rest of the house remained asleep, wrapped in the arrogant ignorance of the impending catastrophe. I sat in the basement command center. The digital execution had been meticulously mapped out during the darkest hours of the night. It was time to transition from investigation to active containment. Chloe and Julian had planned to use the physical beauty of my property as a stage to project their fraudulent wealth. I was not going to smash the garden, nor was I going to hire movers to strip the furniture like a scorned, impulsive victim. A true architect does not destroy the infrastructure. He simply revokes the access credentials of the unauthorized users. I was about to enact absolute, uncompromising technological martial law. When I built this sprawling suburban sanctuary, I didn't just lay bricks and plant imported flora. I designed an integrated, state-of-the-art smart home system, a centralized, closed-loop network that controlled every single mechanical and electrical function of the estate. From the ambient climate control to the perimeter security, the house was a living machine, and I was its sole creator. I opened the root access terminal on my main server. My fingers moved across the mechanical keyboard with the fluid, practiced precision of a surgeon operating on a familiar patient. I began with the perimeter. I navigated to the biometric access controls. For the past 6 months, Chloe and Julian had freely breezed through the heavy wrought iron gates and the mahogany front doors using their thumbprints, facial recognition profiles, and smartphone proximity tokens. With 3 swift keystrokes, I highlighted their digital profiles. I did not pause. I hit the delete command. Their access rights were instantly, permanently wiped from the mainframe. Their fingerprints were now nothing more than unrecognized smudges on the glass scanners. Their phones, dead weight. Next, I moved to the aesthetic infrastructure, the very elements Julian was relying on to dazzle his venture capital investors. I accessed the automated landscape matrix. I completely disabled the intricate network of ambient LED uplighting that usually illuminated the ancient oak trees and the pathways. I shut down the massive water pumps that fed the cascading fountains and the koi ponds, draining the dynamic energy from the garden and leaving it stagnant and silent. I overrode the climate control in the conservatory, dropping the temperature to a crisp, uninviting 50 degrees. I locked down the entire house, engaging the heavy motorized deadbolts on every single exterior door and window. The smart blinds descended simultaneously, sealing the mansion in an impenetrable, blind fortress of stone and glass. The stage was officially dismantled. The theater was permanently closed. With the physical perimeter secured, I shifted my focus to the financial containment. The bleeding of Eleanor's medical fund had been halted the moment I discovered it. The remaining capital immediately rerouted into an encrypted offshore trust that Chloe could never even conceptualize, let alone access. But there was still the matter of the fraudulent assets they had already acquired. I picked up the secure, encrypted landline on my desk and dialed the direct number for my private wealth manager in New York. The conversation was brief, devoid of emotion, and entirely transactional. I instructed him to immediately freeze all secondary credit accounts, black cards, and auxiliary lines of credit attached to my primary portfolio. I flagged Chloe's specific spending profiles for severe fraud review. Any attempt to swipe a card, purchase a coffee, or secure a hotel room would now be met with an embarrassing, automated decline. But freezing the credit cards was merely a local quarantine. I needed to address the massive international liability, the Mediterranean honeymoon. Chloe had stolen tens of thousands of dollars from her mother's physical therapy fund to secure a non-refundable premium deposit on a luxury yacht charter along the Amalfi Coast. In the digital age, luxury brokers do not operate on trust. They operate on verified liquidity and risk management. I compiled a heavily encrypted, anonymous data packet. Inside this digital envelope, I placed the undeniable forensic proof of Chloe's embezzlement, the routing numbers, the forged invoices, and the direct link between Eleanor's medical account and the maritime brokerage. I also included a copy of Julian's fraudulent venture capital prospectus, explicitly highlighting his forged property deeds to demonstrate a pattern of severe financial deceit. I routed this packet through a series of proxy servers to mask the origin, sending it directly to the risk management and compliance department of the yacht charter company in Italy. I knew exactly how their algorithms would react. In the world of high-end maritime leasing, any whisper of credit fraud or stolen funds triggers an immediate, automated termination of services to avoid international money laundering liabilities. I watched the data packet successfully transmit across the globe. By the time the Italian office opened, the compliance officers would flag the account. The deposit would be frozen and seized, pending a fraud investigation. The luxury charter would be permanently canceled, and Chloe and Julian would be blacklisted from every reputable broker in the Mediterranean. The illusion of their elite status was rapidly dissolving into thin air. By the time the sun fully crested the horizon on Friday morning, the day before the grand engagement party, the extraction protocols were complete. I left the cold sanctuary of the basement and walked back upstairs to the master suite. The house was entirely silent, save for the soft, rhythmic breathing of my wife. Eleanor was still asleep, her delicate, tired face resting against the white pillows. The slight droop on the left side of her mouth, the very feature our daughter had deemed too ugly for the public eye, filled me with a profound, protective ache. I moved quietly, pulling 2 leather travel bags from the top shelf of the closet. I packed efficiently. I did not pack evening wear or formal suits. I packed thick cashmere sweaters, warm wool trousers, and every single one of Eleanor's imported medications. I was not packing for a vacation. I was packing for a complete atmospheric extraction. We were leaving this toxic environment and heading to a place of absolute isolation and natural healing. I had used my secure networks to book a private, long-term lease on a secluded, rustic wooden cabin nestled on the pristine shores of a glacial lake in the Swiss Alps. It was a place surrounded by towering snow-capped peaks and ancient pine forests, a place entirely devoid of cellular towers, social media influencers, and the suffocating pressure of corporate posturing. It was exactly what Eleanor's shattered nervous system needed. I sat on the edge of the mattress and gently stroked Eleanor's uninjured right hand. Her eyes fluttered open, blinking against the morning light. "Arthur?" she murmured, her voice still weak and raspy. "What time is it?" "The caterers. Chloe said the caterers are arriving today." A look of conditioned panic flashed in her eyes as she tried to sit up, her body automatically preparing to endure the agony of the tasks Chloe had assigned her. I leaned down and kissed her forehead, silencing her fears with the warmth of my lips. "There are no caterers today, my love," I whispered gently. "You are not touching a single flower. We are going on a trip, just you and me, somewhere quiet, where the air is cold, and the only thing you have to do is rest." Eleanor looked at the packed leather bags by the door, then looked back at my face. She saw the unwavering, absolute certainty in my eyes. She didn't ask about the party. She didn't ask about Chloe. The exhaustion in her soul surrendered completely to the profound relief of being rescued. She simply nodded, letting out a long, shaky breath, and allowed me to help her dress in her warmest, softest clothes. A black private executive transport vehicle arrived at the edge of the driveway precisely at 9 o'clock. I carefully wheeled Eleanor out of the house, locking the massive oak front doors behind us. The crisp morning air kissed our faces. I settled Eleanor comfortably into the plush leather seats of the transport, wrapping a thick blanket over her lap. The driver loaded our bags into the trunk. "Give me just one moment, please," I told the driver. I walked back up the winding paved driveway toward the massive, heavily fortified wrought iron main gates of the estate. I did not carry a long, emotional letter. I did not write a list of their failures or demand an apology. Explanations are for those who seek reconciliation, and I was entirely finished negotiating with terrorists. In my coat pocket was a single sheet of heavy, weatherproof adhesive paper. Printed precisely in the center of the stark white square was a complex, dense QR code. I had generated it in the basement just hours prior. It was a digital lockbox, an executable file of consequences that would only trigger when scanned by the intended recipients. I peeled the backing off the adhesive paper, I stood in front of the towering iron gates, the very gates Chloe and Julian intended to open wide for their wealthy investors tomorrow evening. I pressed the QR code firmly onto the cold black metal, exactly at eye level. It stood out like a silent, devastating digital sentinel against the iron bars. I turned my back on the estate, the smart home fortress I had built and locked down. I walked back to the waiting vehicle, climbed inside, and took Eleanor's hand in mine. "To the private terminal, please," I instructed the driver. The engine purred to life, and the vehicle pulled away from the curb. As we drove toward the airport, heading toward the sanctuary of the Swiss Alps, I felt the heavy, toxic burden of the past 6 months completely evaporate. The firewall was impenetrable. The assets were secured. The trap was perfectly laid, and the countdown had officially begun. All that remained was for the parasites to strike the match and watch their own fraudulent world burn to ash in the dark. The transition from the toxic, suffocating atmosphere of our suburban estate to the absolute purity of the Swiss Alps was nothing short of a physical resurrection. We landed in Geneva as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a brilliant, bruised canopy of violet and gold over the snow-capped peaks. A private helicopter transported us the rest of the way, bypassing the winding mountain roads and depositing us directly at the secluded, rustic wooden chalet I had secured on the pristine shores of a glacial lake. The air here was a revelation. It was crisp, thin, and tasted faintly of ancient pine and untouched snow. There was no hum of city traffic, no frantic pinging of social media notifications, and most importantly, there was no demanding, shrill voice echoing down a hallway, demanding my wife's labor. I carried Eleanor over the threshold of the cabin. The interior was a masterpiece of warm, polished wood, heated by a massive stone fireplace that was already roaring with a welcoming blaze. I settled her onto a plush, overstuffed sofa wrapped in thick wool blankets. For the first time in 4 agonizing months, I watched the permanent, defensive tension physically drain from her body. The slight, permanent furrow between her brows smoothed away. She did not need the heavy wheelchair in this cozy single-level space. She leaned her head back against the cushions, closed her eyes, and let out a long, shuddering breath of absolute relief. We were completely unplugged from the frantic world we had left behind. There was no agenda here, no floral centerpieces to build, and no appearances to maintain. There was only the crackle of the fire, the gentle lapping of the lake water against the wooden dock outside, and the profound, healing silence of a sanctuary that truly belonged to us. However, while I had physically removed us from the blast radius, I was not going to miss the detonation. It was Saturday evening back on the east coast of the United States. The golden hour had passed, and the deep, inky shadows of dusk were rapidly consuming the suburbs. I sat in a heavy leather armchair near the cabin window, a steaming mug of black coffee resting on the table beside me. I opened my encrypted military-grade tablet and initiated a secure, proxy-routed connection to the localized surveillance network I'd left running at the estate. The high-definition screen flickered to life, displaying a grid of ultra-clear, night vision-enabled camera feeds monitoring the perimeter of my property. The estate was an absolute tomb. The sprawling botanical gardens, usually bathed in the warm, inviting glow of the automated LED uplighting, were swallowed by complete, impenetrable darkness. The massive koi ponds and cascading fountains were dead, their surfaces still and stagnant like black glass. The grand mansion itself stood as a monolithic silhouette against the night sky, its smart blinds tightly sealed, completely devoid of light, warmth, or life. It was a fortress that had severed all ties to the outside world. Precisely at 7 o'clock, the silent road leading to our cul-de-sac became a parade of arrogant, manufactured wealth. I watched through the camera lens as a sleek black town car glided to a halt in front of my massive wrought iron gates. It was immediately followed by a stretched limousine, and then another, until a fleet of high-end luxury vehicles idled bumper to bumper on the street. The heavy doors of the lead vehicle opened. Julian stepped out first. He was dressed in a rented, bespoke tuxedo that he wore with the stiff, practiced arrogance of a man who firmly believed he was about to conquer Silicon Valley. He adjusted his cuffs, his chest puffed out, radiating a desperate, hollow confidence. Chloe emerged from the passenger side, draped in a highly structured, avant-garde, haute couture gown that cost more than most people earned in a year. A gown she had undoubtedly financed with a dangerously over-leveraged credit card. She immediately pulled out her smartphone, the bright ring light of her phone case illuminating her face in the dark, preparing to document her grand, triumphant entrance for her hundreds of thousands of fraudulent, purchased followers. Behind them, the elite guests began to spill out of the limousines. I recognized the faces from the financial dossiers I had audited. These were not friends. They were predators. There were senior partners from ruthless venture capital firms, wealthy angel investors in designer overcoats, and a swarm of Chloe's fellow influencers, all armed with cameras and an insatiable appetite for content. They murmured amongst themselves, adjusting their expensive jewelry, looking toward the sprawling estate with hungry, expectant eyes. They were expecting a lavish display of generational wealth. They were expecting to be dazzled by Julian's supposed grand inheritance. Julian, playing the role of the generous, affluent host, offered Chloe his arm. He turned to the crowd of wealthy investors, projecting his voice into the crisp night air with a theatrical, sweeping gesture toward the dark iron gates. "Welcome, everyone," Julian announced, his voice oozing with faux humility. "Welcome to the family estate. Let's get you all inside out of the cold for some champagne, shall we?" He turned and strode confidently toward the biometric access pedestal mounted into the stone pillar beside the gates. He did not even bother to look at the keypad. He simply pressed his right thumb against the glass scanner, fully expecting the heavy iron gates to swing open in silent, majestic obedience. The scanner flashed a harsh, brilliant red. A sharp, digitized negative beep echoed in the quiet street. Julian's confident smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He quickly recovered, letting out a small, nervous chuckle, glancing back at the investors over his shoulder. "Technology, right? Sometimes the biometrics get a little finicky in the cold," he muttered, attempting to maintain the facade of a tech mogul mildly inconvenienced by his own sophisticated hardware. He wiped his thumb on his expensive tuxedo trousers and pressed it against the glass again. Red flash, negative beep. The silence among the gathered guests began to subtly shift. It was no longer the quiet of anticipation. It was the heavy, awkward silence of elite individuals who are not accustomed to waiting on the sidewalk. A bead of sweat broke out on Julian's forehead despite the November chill. Panic, cold and sharp, began to bleed into his movements. He abandoned the fingerprint scanner and frantically began typing his personalized 6-digit access PIN into the illuminated keypad. Access denied. He typed it again, his fingers jabbing at the keys with increasing, desperate aggression. Access denied. Access denied. Access denied. "Julian, what is taking so long?" Chloe hissed, her manufactured sweet persona cracking as she stepped up to the pedestal. She pushed him aside, her long manicured nails tapping rapidly against the glass as she inputted her own passcode. She held her breath, waiting for the familiar green light that would validate her entire existence. The system flashed an unforgiving, blinding red. Chloe stared at the pedestal, her jaw going slack. The realization that she was completely locked out of her own curated reality struck her like a physical blow. She looked through the iron bars at the massive house in the distance. For the first time, she truly registered the absolute, terrifying darkness of the estate. There were no caterers setting up on the lawn. There were no lights in the conservatory. There was no music. The murmur among the wealthy guests grew louder, shifting from polite confusion to active annoyance. I watched a senior venture capital partner, a man whose approval Julian desperately needed to secure his fraudulent seed funding, crossed his arms tightly over his chest. "I thought you said this was your family's property, Julian," the investor said, his voice carrying clearly through the crisp night air, dripping with unadulterated skepticism. "Are we attending an engagement party, or are we standing on a public sidewalk, staring at an abandoned house?" Julian spun around, his face completely devoid of color. He looked like a cornered animal. I don't understand," he stammered, his voice cracking, entirely stripped of its corporate bravado. "There must be a power outage, a system glitch. The smart home must be doing a firmware update." It was a pathetic, transparent lie, and everyone in the crowd knew it. The street lights above them were blazing, and the neighboring houses in the distance glowed warmly. Chloe completely lost her composure. The pristine, elegant aesthetic she had planned for her social media feed violently shattered. She grabbed the heavy iron bars of the gate and began to shake them, screaming into the dark courtyard. "Mom! Dad!" Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing wildly against the silent stone walls. "Open the gate! The caterers! Where is everyone?" She spun around to Julian, her eyes wide with frantic, unstructured terror. "Call a locksmith, right now! Get someone out here to cut this lock!" "Chloe, it's a 256-bit encrypted biometric magnetic seal," Julian hissed back, his voice thick with sheer panic, finally acknowledging the reality of the hardware I had installed. "A locksmith can't open this. We need a military contractor or the system admin to bypass it." The humiliation was absolute and comprehensive. The elite guests, the very people they had manipulated my wife to impress, were not looking at them with envy or respect. They were looking at them with a potent mixture of pity and profound disgust. The investors had come to evaluate a powerful tech visionary backed by generational wealth. Instead, they were watching a sweating, frantic fraud attempting to break into a dark, locked fortress he clearly did not own. The social death they were experiencing was unspooling in real time, captured by the very influencer friends Chloe had invited. Smartphones were already recording the disastrous scene, whispering commentary about the fake billionaire being locked out of his own party. The carefully constructed shell of their fake lives had cracked open on the sidewalk, exposing the hollow, bankrupt void inside. I sat in the warm, peaceful cabin in the Swiss Alps, sipping my coffee, watching the spectacular collapse of their illusions on the glowing tablet screen. The final firewall had held perfectly. But the audit was not quite finished. They had felt the sting of the lockout, but they had not yet faced the undeniable truth of their crimes. On the screen, Julian, in a final desperate attempt to find a manual override, pulled his phone out and turned on the flashlight. He swept the bright beam across the massive iron gate, searching for a hidden keyhole or a service panel. The bright beam of light hit the exact center of the gate. It illuminated the single sheet of heavy, weatherproof white paper I had stuck to the metal bars that morning. The complex, dense, black and white pixels of the QR code stared back at him like a digital crosshair. I leaned forward in my leather chair, a cold, satisfied calm washing over my entire body. I set my coffee mug down. I reached out and unmuted the microphone on my encrypted tablet. The stage was dark, the audience was furious, and the curtain was about to rise on the final act. Julian's hand shook violently as he held his smartphone up to the massive iron gate. The flashlight beam wavered, illuminating the stark black and white pixels of the QR code I had left behind. In his panicked, desperate state, he must have assumed it was a hidden digital key, a backdoor access portal designed for maintenance or emergency overrides. He opened his camera application, holding the lens steady just long enough for the software to register the complex matrix. A sharp digitized chime rang out from his phone, immediately followed by a profound, heavy mechanical click that echoed from the perimeter walls. Julian let out a breathless gasp of relief, taking a step forward and reaching for the iron bars, fully expecting the gates to finally swing inward. The gates did not move a single millimeter. Instead, a low, powerful hum vibrated through the crisp night air. It was the initiation sequence of the estate's high-fidelity outdoor public address system, a network of hidden, weatherproof speakers I'd installed throughout the stone pillars and garden walls for ambient music during Eleanor's summer garden parties. The speakers cracked to life. The audio did not begin with a voice. It began with the crystal-clear atmospheric sound of a biting alpine wind rustling through ancient pine trees, followed by the soft, rhythmic crackle of a wood-burning fireplace. It was the ambient audio of my Swiss sanctuary, being broadcast directly onto the freezing, chaotic suburban sidewalk thousands of miles away. The crowd of wealthy investors, socialites, and influencers instantly fell silent, their heads turning toward the hidden speakers in collective, absolute confusion. "Julian, what did you just do?" Chloe shrieked, her hands gripping the sides of her head, the meticulously styled strands of her hair coming undone in the winter wind. She rushed toward the gate, staring wildly at the intercom camera mounted above the keypad. "Dad, are you in there? The system is malfunctioning. Open the gate. Everyone is waiting." I sat in my leather armchair in the Alps, staring at the high-definition tablet. I watched her scream into the lens. I did not feel a shred of pity. I reached out and adjusted the microphone gain on my console, ensuring that my voice would carry with the booming, undeniable authority of a judge handing down a final sentence. "The system is not malfunctioning, Chloe," I spoke. My voice echoed out of the perimeter speakers, deep, resonant, and entirely stripped of any paternal warmth. It rolled over the heads of the gathered elite, freezing them in their tracks. I did not yell. I did not project anger. The quiet, glacial precision of my tone was far more terrifying than any shout could ever be. Chloe gasped, stepping back from the gate as if she had been physically struck. "Dad, where are you? The caterers—" "There are no caterers, Chloe," I cut her off, my voice slicing through the cold air like a scalpel. "And there will be no engagement party on this property. Not tonight, not ever." A collective murmur of shock rippled through the crowd of high-net-worth guests. Julian's face turned an ashen, sickly gray. He realized in that exact moment that the QR code was not a key. It was a digital tribunal, and the trial was being broadcast live to the very people he needed to impress. "I am speaking to you from a remote, secure location," I continued, my voice echoing evenly across the dark street. "I am currently sitting with my wife, Eleanor. She is resting comfortably, far away from the toxic environment you attempted to cultivate inside our home. I am broadcasting this over the perimeter audio because there are people standing behind you who deserve to know exactly who they are dealing with." I paused, letting the crackle of the Swiss fireplace bleed through the speakers, forcing the anxious crowd to wait on my next word. "To the guests gathered on the sidewalk," I announced, addressing the crowd directly. "My name is Arthur. I am the sole legal owner of the estate you are currently staring at. You were invited here tonight under the pretense of celebrating an elite engagement. You were promised a display of sophistication and wealth. Instead, you have been dragged into a pathetic, fraudulent illusion orchestrated by two common predators." I watched on the monitor as a senior partner from a prominent venture capital firm, a man wearing a bespoke overcoat, took a slow, deliberate step away from Julian, his eyes narrowing in sharp, calculating suspicion. "Let us begin with the hostess," I said, shifting my digital crosshairs directly onto my daughter. "Chloe, you are currently wearing a haute couture gown that cost more than a small vehicle. Just 3 weeks ago, you asked me for $10,000, claiming you needed it to hire a 5-star catering team to impress your future in-laws. But I am an auditor of digital data, Chloe. I traced the wire transfers. There is no catering team. You pocketed that $10,000 to purchase designer accessories to fund your hollow, fabricated life on the internet." Chloe let out a strangled, horrified sob, covering her mouth with her hands. The influencer friends standing nearby immediately lowered their phones, their eyes widening in shock as the facade of her wealth was brutally ripped away. "But the theft of my money is not your true crime," I continued, my voice dropping an octave, heavy with unadulterated disgust. To cover up your embezzlement, you ordered your mother, a woman who survived a massive, paralyzing stroke just 4 months ago, to act as your unpaid, unseen laborer. You forced a disabled woman to construct 50 massive floral centerpieces with her bare, trembling hands until they literally bled. And then you explicitly commanded her to hide in a back bedroom for the entirety of tonight's event, because her recovering, drooping face did not fit the aesthetic of your brand. A collective gasp went up from the crowd. Several women in the audience covered their mouths in genuine horror. In the circles of the true elite, ruthlessness in business is often tolerated, but the blatant, sociopathic abuse of a crippled mother is a line of profound moral bankruptcy that no one wishes to be associated with. You are not a lifestyle influencer, Chloe, I stated with absolute crushing finality. You are a parasite. I did not give the crowd time to process the shock. I immediately pivoted the execution to the man standing frozen beside her. And now, to the groom, I said. Julian. Julian flinched, his eyes darting wildly toward the venture capital partners standing in the crowd. He raised his hands, stammering frantically at the intercom. Arthur, please, let's handle this privately. This is a misunderstanding. The investors are here. I know exactly who is standing behind you, Julian, I interrupted, my voice booming over the speakers. I am speaking directly to the managing partners of the venture capital firms you invited tonight. I have intercepted and decrypted the financial prospectus Julian sent to your offices. The senior VC partner stepped forward, his expression hardening into a mask of cold, professional fury. He was listening intently. In your investment prospectus, Julian listed this estate, my home, the property I purchased 30 years ago, as his own personal collateral to secure your seed funding, I revealed, delivering the fatal blow to his corporate ambitions. He forged digital property deeds and falsified trust documents to present himself as the heir to a fortune that does not exist. Julian owns absolutely nothing. He is a fraud, attempting to leverage my lifelong labor to steal your capital. Julian fell to his knees on the cold concrete. He didn't even try to deny it. The undeniable truth of the raw data had completely paralyzed him. Furthermore, I continued, ensuring every single agonizing detail was laid bare, Julian and Chloe have been actively funding their luxurious lifestyle by systematically draining the medical emergency account intended for my wife's neurological recovery. They stole the money meant for a disabled woman's physical therapy to purchase hundreds of thousands of fake bot followers on social media and to place a premium deposit on a luxury yacht charter in the Mediterranean. I let the silence hang in the air for 5 long seconds. That yacht charter has been permanently canceled by the broker's fraud department, I concluded smoothly. Your credit lines have been frozen. The biometric locks on this estate have been permanently wiped. You have absolutely nothing left to steal. I looked at the high-definition monitor. The scene on the sidewalk was a portrait of absolute devastation. The wealthy investors, the venture capital partners, and the socialites did not offer a single word of sympathy. They did not ask for clarification. People of that stature do not waste their time or breath on exposed toxic liabilities. They simply reacted with cold, calculating self-preservation. The senior VC partner gave Julian one final look of pure, unfiltered disgust. He turned on his heel, signaling to his associates, and walked briskly back to his idling limousine. The rest of the elite crowd immediately followed suit. The influencers, realizing that associating with Chloe was now a catastrophic brand risk, quickly deleted their videos and scrambled into their town cars. Wait, please, let me explain, Julian begged, crawling forward on the concrete, reaching out toward the departing investors. They completely ignored him. The heavy doors of the limousines slammed shut in a synchronized rhythmic procession. The engines revved, and one by one, the fleet of luxury vehicles pulled away from the curb, leaving Julian and Chloe entirely alone in the dark, freezing street in front of a locked, impenetrable fortress. Chloe collapsed onto the sidewalk, her expensive haute couture gown pooling in the dirty winter slush. She wept hysterically, the sound echoing miserably through the microphone of the intercom. I looked at their broken, weeping figures on my screen. I did not feel a surge of triumphant joy. I only felt the quiet, clinical satisfaction of an architect who had successfully purged a catastrophic virus from the system. I reached out and tapped the red icon on my tablet. The audio connection severed instantly. The outdoor speakers at the estate powered down, plunging the suburban street back into absolute, deafening silence. The digital tribunal was over. The masks had fallen, and the true faces of the monsters had been exposed to the world. In the realm of cybersecurity, a catastrophic system failure is rarely a solitary, isolated event. When a critical vulnerability is finally exposed and the foundational code is compromised, it triggers a rapid, irreversible cascade of secondary failures. We call it a cascading collapse, a domino effect where every interconnected lie, every fraudulent bypass, and every piece of corrupted data simultaneously crumbles under the crushing weight of reality. I did not need a network of hidden cameras to witness the spectacular implosion of Julian's fabricated empire. I was thousands of miles away, breathing in the crisp, healing alpine air of Switzerland, watching the color slowly return to my wife's cheeks. But I had spent 40 years operating in the ruthless, unforgiving arenas of corporate finance and digital security. I knew exactly how the algorithms of ruin functioned. Once I had injected the undeniable truth into their ecosystem on that freezing Friday night, the resulting sequence of destruction was entirely automated. The weekend passed in a blur of desperate, panicked scrambling for Chloe and Julian. Locked out of the estate and stripped of their frozen credit lines, they had been forced to liquidate the last remaining fractions of their personal checking accounts just to secure a cramped, sterile, short-term rental on the outskirts of the city. But the true execution commenced on Monday morning. Julian, driven by the blind, staggering delusion that he could still salvage his manufactured reputation, put on his only remaining tailored suit and commuted to the boutique tech incubator, where he rented an expensive, glass-walled office. He parked his gleaming black luxury SUV in the prime executive courtyard, right in front of the building's expansive lobby windows. He walked into the firm projecting the false, aggressive confidence of a man who believed he could simply talk his way out of a disaster. He intended to spin the Friday night lockout as a bizarre, unfortunate misunderstanding with his eccentric, retiring father-in-law. He severely underestimated the speed at which elite money protects itself. At exactly 10:30 in the morning, while Julian was sitting in a transparent conference room, attempting to pitch a mid-level project to his peers, a heavy industrial diesel tow truck rolled into the pristine corporate courtyard. The loud, grinding mechanical roar of the engine violently shattered the hushed, professional quiet of the plaza. Julian looked up from his presentation, his eyes locking onto the scene outside the glass walls. He watched in slow, horrified motion as the blue-collar tow truck driver casually backed up to the gleaming black luxury SUV. Bright, aggressive amber warning lights flashed rhythmically, reflecting off the polished lobby windows, immediately drawing the attention of everyone on the ground floor. Heavy steel hooks were loudly, unceremoniously attached to the pristine undercarriage of the vehicle. Panic, raw and suffocating, seized Julian by the throat. He completely abandoned his meeting, sprinting wildly out of the conference room and rushing down the main staircase. He burst through the revolving glass doors of the lobby, shouting desperately at the driver to stop, waving his arms and demanding an explanation. He attempted to utilize his usual corporate bravado, commanding the driver to unhook the vehicle immediately, citing a simple banking error. The tow truck driver, a man completely unimpressed by bespoke wool suits and Silicon Valley buzzwords, simply chewed his gum and handed Julian a laminated, legally binding notice of repossession. As the primary leaseholder of the vehicle, I had legally revoked my financial guarantor status early Friday morning. I had notified the dealership that the primary driver had no independent capital and was actively engaged in financial fraud. The dealership had flagged the account for severe default, bypassing the usual grace periods, and issued an immediate recovery order. The hydraulic lift engaged with a loud mechanical whine, raising the luxury vehicle high into the air. Julian stood on the cold concrete of the courtyard, paralyzed by the sheer, undeniable magnitude of the public humiliation. The carefully constructed armor of his success was being ripped away in broad daylight. Junior analysts, receptionists, and senior executives alike gathered near the expansive lobby windows, watching the self-proclaimed tech visionary be publicly stripped of his manufactured wealth. But the repossession of a vehicle was merely the opening act. The true fatal blow to his existence was waiting for him back upstairs. The venture capital partners who had stood outside my dark estate on Friday night were not men who forgave being made fools of. They had not merely walked away from the engagement party, they had spent the weekend making phone calls. Wealthy, powerful people have an incredibly efficient communication network. By Monday morning, the true nature of Julian's fraudulent financial prospectus had been circulated to the compliance boards of every major firm in the district. Julian had barely made it back to his desk, his hands still trembling from the humiliation in the courtyard, when his desk phone rang. He was summoned immediately to the top-floor executive suite. The atmosphere in the boardroom was completely devoid of the usual fraternal corporate warmth. The managing director of the incubator sat at the head of the long mahogany table. Next to him sat the chief compliance officer and two stern-faced corporate security guards. Placed perfectly in the center of the table was a printed copy of Julian's investment prospectus, the exact document containing the forged property deeds and the falsified trust assets linking him to my estate. They did not ask Julian for an explanation. In the highly regulated tech and finance sector, utilizing forged assets to solicit venture capital is not a simple mistake. It is a catastrophic, federal-level compliance violation. They informed him flatly that his personal financial instability, combined with the hostile withdrawal of his primary investors and the undeniable proof of his document forgery, made him an unacceptable, toxic liability to their firm. He was a massive security risk, a man who had brought the stench of fraud into their pristine hallways. He was not offered a generous severance package. He was not offered a graceful transition period to save face or quietly seek other employment. He was terminated effectively immediately. The compliance officer slid a flat, unfolded cardboard box across the polished table. Julian was given exactly 20 minutes to clear his personal belongings from his desk under the close, unyielding, and humiliating supervision of the security guards. Julian carried his solitary cardboard box toward the main elevators. The carpeted hallway felt 1,000 miles long, an endless, suffocating gauntlet of shame. The same ambitious colleagues who had eagerly sought his advice just days prior now rapidly averted their eyes, staring intently at their computer monitors, treating him like a man infected with a highly contagious, fatal disease. He stepped into the elevator cage and watched the brushed steel doors slide shut, permanently closing the final chapter on the career he had arrogantly believed was entirely his own brilliant creation. He had genuinely believed he was a self-made giant, a titan conquering the digital world. He realized too late, as the elevator plummeted toward the ground floor, that he was merely a fragile paper kite, flying solely on the steady, invisible wind of my silent, endless generosity. Now the wind had completely stopped, and gravity was claiming its inevitable, devastating due. Carrying his box of worthless desk ornaments, Julian navigated the crowded, noisy public transit system, taking a commuter train back to the cheap, sterile, short-term rental apartment. He was completely hollowed out, a man who had lost his car, his career, and his reputation in the span of 3 hours. He walked up the dingy concrete stairs, desperate for the comfort of the woman he was supposed to marry. He foolishly believed that because they had plotted together, They would survive the fallout together. He unlocked the thin, hollow core door of the apartment. The small living room was in a state of frantic, chaotic movement. Chloe was not waiting for him with open arms. She was dressed in her expensive cashmere travel coat, forcefully shoving her remaining designer clothes into two massive, luxury suitcases. Julian dropped his cardboard box on the cheap laminate floor. "Chloe, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice cracking, thick with exhaustion and panic. Chloe stopped packing. She slowly turned to face him. The expression on her face was completely devoid of sympathy, love, or foundational partnership. It was the exact same cold, calculating, and judgmental disgust that the venture capital partners had looked at him with on Friday night. In the natural world, a parasite does not attempt to heal a dying host. It simply detaches itself and searches for a new, viable victim to drain. "I am leaving you, Julian," Chloe stated, her voice flat, sharp, and entirely stripped of the manufactured sweetness she utilized for her online videos. "What? No, Chloe, you can't," Julian pleaded, taking a step toward her. "I just got fired. They towed the car. We have to figure this out together. We're getting married." Chloe let out a short, harsh laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Married? To what? You have absolutely nothing, Julian. You lied to me. You told me you had those investors locked down. You told me you were going to be a millionaire. But you're just a fraud who got caught playing with my father's assets." "I lied?" Julian shouted, the sheer hypocrisy finally snapping his fragile composure. "You stole from your own mother's medical fund. Your father exposed you to the entire city. You're radioactive, Chloe. Your brand is dead." "And whose fault is that?" she shrieked back, zipping up her suitcase with a violent tug. "If you had just secured the funding, none of this would have happened. I refuse to be shackled to a pathetic, broke man who can't even afford a decent apartment. I am going to stay with a friend in Los Angeles. My lawyers will send you a formal notice breaking the engagement." She did not wait for his defense. She did not listen to his desperate, frantic apologies or his begging. She grabbed the handles of her expensive, stolen luggage and walked straight toward the door. She maneuvered around him as if he were nothing more than an inconvenient piece of broken furniture. She walked out into the hallway and pulled the door shut behind her. The sharp metallic click of the cheap lock echoed loudly through the small, empty room. Julian stood completely alone in the center of a rented room he could no longer afford. His grand, flawless facade was thoroughly and permanently annihilated, crushed into dust under the immense, heavy weight of its own vanity. The dominoes had fallen perfectly, one by one, until there was absolutely nothing left standing. He fell to his knees beside his cardboard box, burying his face in his hands, alone in the dark ruins of a life he had completely destroyed. 3 months passed under the protective, silent canopy of the Swiss Alps. In that remote wooden cabin, surrounded by ancient glaciers and towering pines, the toxic residue of the life we had left behind slowly evaporated into the thin, clean air. Time was no longer measured by the frantic pinging of social media notifications or the exhausting demands of ungrateful children. It was measured by the gentle shifting of the alpine sun, the crackle of the hearth, and the miraculous steady rhythm of my wife's healing. Removed from the crushing stress and the psychological abuse, Eleanor's recovery accelerated in ways that defied medical expectations. Her damaged neurological pathways, no longer bombarded by cortisol and fear, began to rebuild themselves. When we finally boarded a quiet, private flight back to the United States in early March, the rigid, painful hesitation in her steps was gone. We returned to our sprawling, suburban estate on a crisp, bright Tuesday morning. I accessed my digital command center and reversed the lockdown protocols. The heavy motorized blinds rose, flooding the mansion with natural sunlight. The automated landscaping matrix engaged, and the cascading fountains roared back to life, their waters sparkling in the spring sun. The house breathed again, resurrected and entirely purged of the parasites that had once infected its halls. A profound restorative peace settled over our property. The conservatory, once the site of Eleanor's darkest humiliation, was transformed back into her sanctuary. I stood in the doorway one afternoon watching her. There were no architectural blueprints, no imported white orchids demanded by arrogant investors, and no impossible deadlines. She was gently repotting a collection of delicate, resilient wild roses. Her left hand, though still lacking its original flawless dexterity, was steady. She held the small watering can herself, a soft, genuine smile illuminating her face as the water seeped into the dark, rich soil. She was whole again. The silence of our renewed sanctuary remained absolute and uninterrupted until late Thursday afternoon. I was in my basement office, reviewing my standard security logs, when the perimeter intrusion system emitted a soft, discreet chime. It was not a blaring alarm. It was a simple notification that a physical entity was lingering near the primary access point. I brought up the high-definition camera feed for the main iron gates. Standing on the cold concrete sidewalk, shivering in the biting March wind, was my daughter. The physical transformation of Chloe was stark, undeniable, and deeply tragic. The polished, haughty influencer who had marched through my hallways in haute couture was completely gone. In her place stood a hollowed-out shadow of a young woman. She was wearing a faded, oversized parka and a pair of worn sneakers. Her face, completely devoid of the heavy, meticulous makeup she once used to curate her digital identity, was pale, gaunt, and lined with the exhausting weight of absolute ruin. The expensive hair extensions were gone, leaving her natural hair tied back in a messy, defeated knot. She looked up at the security camera, her eyes red-rimmed and swimming with frantic tears. She reached out a trembling hand and pressed the intercom button. "Dad?" Her voice crackled through the speaker on my console. It was weak, ragged, and entirely stripped of its former arrogant entitlement. "Dad, please, I know you're in there. Please open the gate." I did not press the button to open the iron bars. I closed my laptop, walked up the stairs, and stepped out the front door. The wind whipped across the expansive lawn as I walked slowly down the long paved driveway toward the perimeter wall. Chloe saw me approaching and immediately gripped the thick iron bars of the gate with both hands. Her knuckles turned white against the cold black metal. "Dad, oh thank God," she sobbed, pressing her face against the iron mesh. "Please let me in. It's freezing out here. I have nowhere else to go. I lost everything, Dad. Julian left me. My landlord evicted me yesterday. I've been sleeping in the back of a rental car, and my accounts are completely empty. Please, just open the gate." I stood exactly 3 feet away from the iron barrier. I looked into the eyes of the woman who had callously ordered my disabled wife to hide in a dark room. For 30 years, the sight of my daughter crying would have triggered a deep, biological imperative to immediately soothe, rescue, and absorb her pain. But that instinct had been surgically removed by her own profound cruelty. I observed her performance with the detached, clinical empathy of an architect evaluating a collapsed structure. She was not crying because she felt genuine, soul-crushing remorse for the agony she had inflicted upon her mother. She was crying because the luxurious, comfortable padding that had always insulated her from the consequences of her actions had been entirely incinerated. Chloe realized her tears were not generating the immediate rescue she expected. She frantically shifted her strategy, falling back on her old habits of deflection. "I was manipulated, Dad," she pleaded, her voice rising in a desperate pitch. "Julian pressured me. The internet, the sponsors, the agencies, they all expect this perfect lifestyle. I got in over my head and I made a mistake. I'm so sorry. I'm a victim of this toxic culture, Dad. You have to believe me. Just let me inside, please. I'm your family. I'm your blood." I let the cold wind carry her pathetic excuses away into the empty street. I did not yell. I did not display a single ounce of anger. I looked at her with a quiet, devastating authority that instantly severed her momentum. "Family and blood are not magical firewalls that protect you from accountability, Chloe," I spoke. my voice low and steady. They are built on a foundation of mutual respect and basic human decency. You were not a victim of manipulation. You made a conscious, deliberate choice to view your own mother's physical agony as a disposable resource for your vanity. Chloe's mouth hung open, her frantic pleading dying in her throat. You did not come here today to apologize to Eleanor, I continued mercilessly. You came here today because you are cold and you are hungry, and you want your comfortable bed back. An apology motivated entirely by poverty is not an apology. It is a negotiation tactic. I reached into the inner pocket of my wool coat. I did not pull out a remote control to open the gates. I retrieved a small, encrypted solid-state USB drive and a plain, sealed manila envelope. I stepped forward and slid the two items through the narrow gap between the heavy iron bars. They fell onto the cold concrete sidewalk, landing directly at her worn sneakers. Chloe looked down at the objects in total confusion. She slowly crouched down, picking them up with trembling, freezing fingers. What is this?" she whispered. "Inside that USB drive is a complete, unalterable digital ledger," I explained, my tone echoing with absolute, unforgiving finality. "It contains a precise, itemized accounting of every single dollar you stole from your mother's medical emergency fund. It lists every fraudulent follower you purchased and every stolen cent you transferred to that yacht broker. The math is exact and the debt is undeniable." I pointed to the manila envelope in her other hand. Inside that envelope is a single brass key. It opens the door to a small, extremely cheap studio apartment on the industrial edge of the city. The rent has been paid for exactly 30 days, and not a single day more. Along with the key, you will find a printed job application for a commercial laundromat located 2 blocks from that apartment. Chloe stared at the envelope, her eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated horror as the reality of my words crashed down upon her. The safety net was not being lowered. She was being handed a shovel. "Social media will not save you, Chloe," I told her, delivering the ultimate terms of her survival. "Fakeness, manipulation, and digital illusions will not put food in your mouth or heat in your radiators. You are going to use your actual, physical labor to survive. You are going to work until your hands ache and your manufactured pride is completely broken. And you will use your wages to pay back every single cent into that digital ledger." She looked up at me, her face pale, the tears freezing on her cheeks. She finally realized that the endless reservoir of parental mercy she had relied on her entire life was permanently dressé. "When you finally understand the value of honest sweat," I said softly, stepping back from the gate, "when you have repaid the debt to the woman who gave you life, and when you can look at another human being with genuine empathy instead of calculating their aesthetic value, then, and only then, this gate might open again. Now leave." I did not wait for a reply. I did not offer a final, comforting glance. I turned my back on the iron gate and began the long walk up the driveway toward the warm, glowing windows of the mansion. Behind me, I heard the faint, shuffling sound of Chloe's worn sneakers against the concrete. I did not look back, but I knew she was walking away, clutching the heavy weight of her own reality in her hands, stepping into the harsh, unforgiving winter of her own making. I reached the front porch, unlocked the heavy oak door, and stepped into the warm, fragrant air of the foyer. The house smelled of blooming roses and fresh tea. I walked into the conservatory. Eleanor was sitting comfortably at her table, admiring a perfectly potted, vibrant red rose. She looked up as I entered. She did not ask who had been at the gate. She looked into my eyes and saw the quiet, heavy resolve settling in my chest. She reached out her right hand. I walked over and took her hand in mine. Her skin was incredibly warm, her pulse steady and calm. The trembling that had once defined her days was entirely gone. We stood there together in the quiet sanctuary of our home, bathed in the fading afternoon light. A firewall is not merely a string of complex code, nor is it a cold, unfeeling algorithm designed to punish. A true firewall is an act of profound, unwavering love. It is the strict, uncompromising discipline required to isolate the rot, to sever the toxic connections, and to fiercely protect the sacred, beating heart of the system. We had survived the breach. The perimeter was secure, and in the quiet warmth of our home, the garden was finally free to bloom again.